Sega.
Yahoo!
There are some games in history that are true game changers. Virtua Fighter is undoubtedly one of those. This was the first 3D polygon-based fighting game in the arcade, in an era when hand-drawn sprites ruled the roost. Yu Suzuki and the AM2 team, who had already been responsible for many of Sega's greatest 1980s arcade titles, pulled out all the stops to show that people made of polygons could hit each other just as well as sprites. First, we'll look at the original arcade version of Virtua Fighter, running on Sega's Model 1 arcade board in all its flat-shaded polygon glory. For this I'll be using MAME, although the emulation isn't perfect. Next we'll look at the arcade version of Virtua Fighter Remix, which ran on Sega's STV board and was essentially an arcade port of the Sega Saturn release. This I'm running using the Mednafen emulator, as it doesn't play properly in MAME. After that we'll take a look at the rare PC version of Virtua Fighter Remix, which released exclusively for Nvidia's first graphics chip, the NV1, to see what improvements it had. And finally we'll compare that to Virtua Fighter PC, the mass market release for Windows. Sega's Model 1 arcade hardware was initially used for Virtua Racing, and its bigger brother Virtua Formula, a Formula 1 racing style title. Whilst 3D polygon-based racing games had been seen before, notably Atari's Hard Driving and Taito's Winning Run, no one had yet made a one-on-one polygon-based 3D fighting game for the arcade. Virtua Fighter was, therefore, truly breaking new ground, and featured 8 fighters, plus a boss character, each of which would use a real martial arts style. The arcade version begins with an attack sequence, showing each of the fighters defeating another fighter in sequence. It also shows off how hair, bandanas, belts, and even individual fingers animate. There's a lot of 3D detail going on. After the title screen, there's a quick recap of how to play the game, and the high score table. After the title screen shows again, the game then replays the most recent fight that took place on the machine, essentially showing the next player where the last one failed. When you start the game, you can choose from one of the 8 playable characters. I tend to use Sarah as I know some of her moves. I'm by no means a pro Virtua Fighter player though. A quick word about MAME's emulation. Whilst the graphics look pretty good here, the gameplay is off, with moves often failing to connect and the fighters getting a bit stuck inside one another. But it's fine to show what the game actually looked like. Ultimately you fight up to 3 rounds, with a knockout or ring out giving you a point. 2 points and you move on to the next fighter. The game plays with a joystick and 3 buttons, punch, kick and guard, and you can pull off various moves by combining joystick movements with button presses. After fighting Sarah's brother Jackie, then Jeffrey, I go on to fight myself. On this stage the underlighting stands out, plus how each character has an alternate outfit. And I get beaten by myself, literally and figuratively, as I step out of the ring fighting Sarah. In order to progress further, I changed the arcade dip switches to make the game much easier, so we can take a look at the later stages. After Sarah's stage, you get to fight the ninja Kagi, who due to the flaws in the emulation, I can beat by spamming him with low punches. Not a very cool way to win. Pi is up next, on a floating barge, which will become a recurring theme of Virtua Fighter. Like Kagi's face mask, you can knock Pi's hat off too. The wrestler Wolf is next, in this nicely lit evening stage. Again, I'm able to largely cheese him with low punches. This is not possible in the real arcade game. Pi's father Lau is the next opponent. There is a bit of backstory to the characters, but it's not largely spelt out in the game itself. Sarah is apparently suffering from brainwashing. The last of the regular opponents is the arcade poster boy Akira. Even at this reduced difficulty, he is a hard opponent to beat, and it took many credits. Once you beat Akira, you take on the final character, Durao, a robotic female. Later games expanded her backstory into being Kagi's mother, but here she's just a metal bonus character you get at the end, who has 1 extra round over the regular characters. Eventually, Durao beats me, but it doesn't matter, as you still get the credit sequence showing all your victories. You then get to enter your name, but this part is quite flickery in MAME, so here's a minute of this version without me talking over it. When Sega ported Virtua Fighter to the Sega Saturn console, it was a bit of a rushed release and featured some graphical glitches that didn't show the game in its best light. So a few months later they released Virtua Fighter Remix, with improved graphics and fully texture-mapped characters. This in turn then appeared in the arcade on the Saturn-derived STV arcade board. The American version begins with the classic anti-drugs message, a Sega and AM2 logo, then the title screen. The intro sequence then plays, but it lacks the hit sound effects that the arcade original used. It's largely similar to the Model 1 version, but you can clearly see its lower resolution with less polygons used. For instance, the fighters no longer have individually modelled fingers, but it is very colourful. A short demo then advertises the optional ranking mode, before the intro sequence repeats. The high score table is then shown later on, but there's no replay of a recent fight on this version. The characters now have nice hand-drawn portraits, which still animate when you choose a character. I'll go with Sarah again. Everything is now fully texture mapped, which does mean the stage looks a bit less detailed perhaps. Also, the sound and music have taken a hit, with the music dying out and looping quite often. Obviously the home Sega Saturn port had access to CD audio, so could use longer music tracks and had more space to store higher quality audio. As before, it's Jackie, and then Jeffrey, before I fight myself. As everything is texture mapped now, the underfloor lighting no longer lights the characters in the same way as the Model 1 original. But one thing is the same, it's me losing to Sarah. So now I've switched everything to super easy and just one round per fight, which means beating Sarah is easier. After that we find that Kagi now has a nice purple outfit, and I ring out myself twice, before I eventually defeat him. Pi is again a little annoying, but the easier settings let me defeat her pretty quickly. Wolf's stage actually still looks pretty good here. We moon jump around a bit, before I take him out. Over to Lau and he dumps me on the floor, then defeats me. On the second go, I manage to beat him. Akira is just as hard though, and keeps wiping me out. After many attempts I finally beat him and move on to Durao, who in this version is sporting more of a golden shade. As before, she has 2 rounds where everyone else only had 1. The reduced difficulty sees me win here, eventually. The end sequence then plays, and the flicker as the game switches stages in the replay is noticeable. At least the high score table here doesn't flicker quite so much as the Model 1 original. Here's a minute of this version.
Ready, go!
It's a lesser known fact that Virtua Fighter Remix did actually come to the PC, as it was only released bundled with graphics cards based on the Nvidia NV1 spec hardware, which was Nvidia's first ever 3D accelerator. Some versions of the card even included a daughter board so you could connect a Sega Saturn controller to the PC. However, the hardware had flaws. Firstly, it relied on quads, four-sided shapes, for rendering 3D graphics. This was the same as a Sega Saturn, so it enabled games to be ported to the PC more easily. However, the rest of the world decided triangles were better for 3D rendering, so a short while later the NV1 couldn't play anything based on the new Direct3D specification and was consigned to history. The Diamond Edge 3D board shown here came in a number of versions, some with more memory, but developers had to get games to run on the smallest version, meaning games were compromised somewhat. The card also had fairly weak 2D, sound and MIDI capabilities, which meant that it wasn't really the best. I managed to pick up one of these cards in order to make this video. The game itself runs at 640 by 400 resolution and looks immediately sharper. It also introduces gyro shading, which makes the characters look much more rounded than the STV or Saturn versions. In fact, this is probably the best looking version of Virtua Fighter Remix. I'm capturing the game here from my older PC using a VGA capture device. Unfortunately, the NV1 board has some interference patterns on screen, so I think it's a bit worn out. But stick around for the pixel compare later, where I'll take screenshots directly from the hardware so you can see the difference more clearly. This version has a few more modes than the arcade version, but we'll go with the classic arcade mode. Once again I go for Sarah. The portraits on this version look rather blurry, yet colourful. First up I tackle my brother, and you can see how the gyro shading makes legs and arms look more rounded than the STV version. Moving on to Jeffrey, it's worth noting that the textures on the stage and background are a little lower resolution than other versions, presumably to fit it in the available memory of the NV1 card. Fighting Sarah, you can see how the gyro shading here allows the uplighting on the characters to work again, as it was missing from the STV version. Here's Kagi, and once again you can see the stage and background look a little pixelated. Note how much longer the music tracks are on this version, as it uses CD audio for the music, with each stage having music tracks over 5 minutes in length. Kagi proves too tricky for me on this playthrough though, so it's changing the difficulty time again. Pi is next, and well, that was quick. Wolf likes to throw me around, but I eventually defeat him as well. Lau is taken care of quickly too. So how's Akira here? He's still pretty tough, but changing the energy amounts lost per hit means that I beat him in the end. Interestingly, Durao here has reverted to more of a white shade, with no obvious texture maps that the STV version employed. The gyro shading looks great though, really making the character appear more metallic from some angles. Dural takes me right to the end of the third stage, and I win with no energy left at all. The credit sequence is a bit different here, as it lacks the backgrounds and stages. Presumably switching those quickly on the NV1 was a no-go, so they got the boot. There's no high score table in the arcade version of this game though. That's part of the ranking mode. Here's a minute of this version in action.
Go!
After the exclusive Nvidia NV1 version, Sega released a mass-market Windows version of the game. To perhaps differentiate it, they rebranded it as Virtua Fighter PC. The box and CD shown here are my own copies from a triple-pack Fight Night compilation that Expert Software released. The game was released in all sorts of boxes and packaging, however, from bespoke cardboard creations to budget DVD cases. This version runs at 640 by 480 resolution and uses software 3D rendering. All the characters have been lightly redesigned again, maybe to cater for a reduced colour palette. There's also a few speed issues with this version of the game. This version includes a lot more modes than the MV1 port, but again we'll stick with the arcade mode. And Sarah. You'll see the gameplay starts way too fast, but the speed limiter soon kicks in after this initial burst of speed, then the gameplay's fine. The game also allows a fast or smooth graphics mode. I believe fast skips frames on less capable hardware, but both suffer from the initial burst of speed when you start the game. This version of the game has a much taller play area than ones we've seen so far, as both the STV and NV1 versions ran in a letterbox. And the background textures in particular are higher resolution, though do suffer from some colour banding issues. After Jackie, we once again take on Jeffrey, who's tough, but not too tough. Like the STV version, the uplighting on Sarah's stage doesn't really affect the fighters, as their texture maps aren't affected by lighting. Kagi is next, and the improvements in background and stage textures are pretty noticeable here. Pi is up next, and once again it's a stage of flailing hair and falling hats. Wolf's stage still looks pretty colourful, even if the background graininess is a little bit more noticeable. But Wolf's a tough character, and this is where I fail. So let's switch it to easy. This makes Wolf a trivial fighter to beat. Lau is along next, and once again I dispatch him relatively easily. Akira comes and loses me some health, but my mismatched health bars mean I defeat him too. Dural in this version is textured, unlike the MV1 version, but looks more silver than the golden shade of the STV arcade version. Dural is also no pushover, even on easy, but eventually I smack her down. The end sequence, like the MV1 version, lacks the backgrounds and stages. Again, there's no high score table here, as that's limited to the ranking mode. One thing the PC version does have over the other versions though, is that you can turn off the texture mapping and revert the characters to versions of the Model 1 arcade design. These aren't true one-to-one recreations though, as there are no individual fingers here. But at least Sarah's uplighting works on her stage, as you can see now. The arenas themselves also lack the polygon detail of the arcade original, being largely flat squares onto which the textures were painted. But it's fun to see something that feels much more like the original arcade, and mildly amusing that it's unique to the PC version. Let's move on. Here's Pi, and here's Wolf. Here's a look at Lau as he stomps on me, and here's Akira, who still beats me. Finally, Durao is back with the largely white look again. The end sequence also uses the Model 1 style characters of course, which is fun to see. I'll put the textures back on now though, and you can watch a minute of this version in action. And now we reach an interesting part of the comparison, as I've taken screenshots from all versions and aligned them so it's easy to play spot the difference. The NV1 shots here were screen captured on the actual hardware, so there's no interference patterns seen here. First up, here's the arcade title page, which uses a blue metal effect. The STV version has gone gold, more colourful but lower resolution. The NV1 version is a bit narrower but much sharper looking, whilst the PC version has more screen height to play with. I'm not sure the PC logo looks so good though. Here's Arcade Akira vs Sarah, possibly the two most recognisable characters. Note that they are quite small in the frame, and the camera angle is relatively high up. Wiping across to the arcade version of Remix, you can see it's wider, lower angle, and more pixelated. Wiping to the NV1 version highlights the higher resolution, gyro shading, but lower quality stage and background detail. Here's the PC version to compare. Finally, let's switch to the Model 1 style characters on the PC, and now wipe back to the arcade to see the difference. Let's do the same with Pi and her dad Lau. Here's the Model 1 version, Remix arcade version, NV1 version, PC version, PC with flat textures, and back to the Model 1 version again. Here are the tough guys Wolf and Jeffrey in the original version. Here is Remix Arcade, and the NV1 version. Over to the PC version, and without textures. Then back to the arcade original. Note the arena design change. Finally, here's Kagi and Jackie on the original Model 1 arcade hardware, Remix Arcade, NV1 version, PC version, flat shaded PC version, and back to the Model 1 original. Let's put all four versions head to head. I'll pick a few fights that lasted long enough, plus some action against Durao.
Fight 1, ready, go! KO!
Virtua Fighter was a groundbreaking game in many ways and ushered in the modern 3D polygon-based fighting games, and it's all thanks to the vision of Yu Suzuki and the AM2 team. The arcade original, though imperfectly emulated in MAME, is still the most detailed of all versions, with fingers and toes rendered in chunky polygons. Virtua Fighter Remix on the STV is nice, but the reduction in audio is noticeable. The Nvidia NV1 port has arguably the most realistic looking fighters thanks to the gyro shading, but does lose a little quality elsewhere. The PC version has the most options, along with the ability to switch the models back to something closer to the Model 1 original, yet it feels like the colours are a little bit more muted here. If I had to pick a version to play, I'd probably go for the NV1 version for the looks, the PC version for the options, and the arcade original for the gameplay. Just not the version in MAME currently. You'd need to seek out a real arcade machine, or try the port in the Sega Astro City mini home cabinet. If you like this comparison of Virtua Fighter, then give it a like, or subscribe, ring the bell, leave a comment, and join me next time for a roaring start! Yeah, you know what's coming.